And I see you chomping at the bit over there to come in with...
Well, I'm worried that there isn't enough of a sense of urgency, actually, that we are both still thinking of tinkering with the institutions we have rather than seriously rethinking them, but also that the absence of a sense of urgency does not befit the hour. The Israel question has defied solution for far too long. It is poisoning all our relations, and if we don't tackle that as the absolute top priority, I mean, actually, the greatest mistake of this Bush administration was just putting it to one side and not making it the top priority. It's poisoning relations within Europe. That's one side of it. Let us be honest about Iran. There is tremendous sympathy in the world for Iran's position. There are an awful lot of people who actually think the Iranians why shouldn't they have nuclear weapons? You've allowed Israel to have nuclear weapons. You've allowed India and Pakistan to have nuclear weapons. Why not? And countries like Brazil and South Africa have a lot of sympathy for Iran. We should recognize that and not think that we've got some holy Western model that is the perfect model any longer. I don't think the West exists any longer. I think NATO should have been reformed long ago, far more radically than it has been. Don't you think we should tackle these sort of issues? I mean, Secretary General, haven't we really blown it by not reforming NATO much more radically and bringing the Russians into it properly?
Before I give you an answer, I think I could ask you what kind of reform, apart from the process we're in, what kind of reform you would have preferred to see in bringing about another NATO? I started with NATO's core function, which I think is as relevant as it has always been. At least that's what the NATO allies think. But let me, before
I would have
you have a right to
amalgamated
an
it
answer,
with the OSCE and brought the Russians in right from the start, because the problem with NATO today is it's still seen as a Cold War institution. It hasn't changed.
But Quentin, let me interrupt. How do you see NATO possibly as an organization that in today's world functions together with undemocratic authoritarian regimes? NATO is an alliance of common values, and to bring in authoritarian regimes that do not respect the fundamental values of liberal democracy would mean then you end up with an OSCE that does nothing.
We regarded NATO enlargement as being a way of exporting our democratic values to countries like Romania, Bulgaria. Now we're going to do it to Albania and so on. Now I know who you're talking about, but actually create the institutions that will integrate we're getting into very deep territory, but I think the next 2 days should try to tackle more radical issues than just tinkering with what we've got.
I'm ready briefly to go one step further than President Ilves. I still think, despite the major differences and difficulties we have at the moment with Russia, as an uneasy partner, let me put it mildly, as an uneasy partner, and as a nation which, I repeat, is trying to change borders by force. I still think, despite all this, that there is a need for stronger and more engagement with Russia. But I also follow the President of Estonia, Tom Ilves, that for being part of that family of nations, there are certain criteria one has to fulfill. I have never seen or heard any ambition by Russia to become a member of NATO, but I would like to have Russia as close to NATO as possible. And I agree with you that we have to think beyond the current circumstances where it is awfully difficult indeed, but defending my own organization, I think NATO has gone and is still going through a fundamental process of reform. Fundamental.
I think that's a good starting point for the discussions to come. I sense that the Prime Minister of Kenya wants to give us a north-south perspective to move us toward, in the next 5 to 10 minutes, the conclusion of this morning's session. And I wanted to perhaps help add a dimension to it as well by referring to something that Prince Turki said when he stressed the importance of the ideological competition for the youth, not only, I think, in the Muslim world, but throughout the world. I wonder if you see this as a problem as well, that there is an ideological competition, and what that would mean in Africa.
Well, yes, but I wanted also basically to contribute to this issue of the nuclear weapons and Iran vis-a-vis the Middle East and the rest of the world. I think I do agree with the position that is being propounded here, that it is really the inability of the rest of the world to reduce the proliferation of nuclear weapons that is responsible for what we now have today. We have been talking about non-proliferation of nuclear weapons for a long time. There are times when we are talking about SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. It just collapsed in those days of the Cold War. And what had happened is that as we've been talking about stopping other nations from acquiring nuclear weapons, those that have them have continued to develop others, instead of destroying those that they have. I mean, we are talking about leadership. Leadership is something that's transient. Today is Ahmadinejad in Iran. Tomorrow there will be somebody else. So what we really need to address is it right for the United States to continue developing nuclear weapons, France to have, Britain and Russia, and then China and India and Pakistan and Israel, and then say, if somebody else wants to develop, they should not develop because they are irresponsible. I think that this is not the right way to approach this issue, that we must deal with this issue in a much more comprehensive manner. Otherwise, there is a kind of discrimination. I mean, yes, we are all concerned about security of Israel, but we must also address the issue of Palestinians, not just as a side issue. I think that is the key issue. Unless we have a lasting solution to the conflict within the Middle East, there will be no peace. And in my view, this issue must be addressed together. It goes together. Now, in as far as North-South is concerned, there is a concern about the disparities which I mentioned. I mentioned that globalization is actually enhancing the disparity, as the poorer countries are made to compete among themselves to be able to attract investment from the North. By attractive conditions, meaning low labor costs, cheaper raw materials, and so on. This actually perpetuates poverty in the South. So this is an issue that also requires to be addressed globally. That how do we, because as these countries democratize, they open up their markets, liberalize, and so on, how do we facilitate resource flows down there, rather than, for example, creating a consumer society in the North, which is based on cheap raw materials and cheap labor in China and in India and Africa? How do we really address this issue? That is my view. In my view, is what will resolve the issue of poverty in the South and try to bridge the gap between North and South, and then eventually the digital divide. Thank you.